Welcome. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Welcome to another of our book and print talks. Book and print talks are presented by the University of Oregon faculty authors whose recently published books were supported by an OHC Research Fellowship and/or an OHC subvention grant to help cover publication costs. If you have questions at the end of the talk, please use the chat feature of Zoom. I will moderate and ask the questions. We've also enabled the closed captioning function of Zoom. You can activate captions using the live transcript option. This talk is being recorded and will be available for viewing later today on the Oregon Humanities Center's website and YouTube channel. The University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilahi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they continue to make important contributions to their communities, to the U of O, to Oregon, and to the world. In following the Indigenous Protocol of acknowledging the original people of the land we occupy, we also extend our respect to the 9 federally recognized indigenous nations of Oregon: the Burns Paiute tribe, the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, the Coquel Indian Tribe, the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians, and the Klamath Tribes. We express our respect to the many more tribes who have ancestral connections to this territory, as well as to all displaced indigenous people who call this place we call Oregon home. It's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker for today. Michael Malik Najjar is Associate Professor of Theater Arts and a participating faculty member in Middle East and North African Studies at the U of O. Professor Najjar's scholarly interests include contemporary Arab American theater and performance, contemporary theater, ethnic studies, critical race theory, and Arab American studies. Professor Najjar is the author of the monograph Arab American Drama, Film, and Performance, a critical study from 2015. He has also edited a series of important anthologies of Middle Eastern and Arab American drama, including 4 Arab American plays, 2014, 6 plays of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, co-edited with Jamil Khoury and Corey Pond, 2019, the selected works of Youssef El Gwindi from 2019, and Heather Raffo's Iraq plays, The Things That Can't Be Said, 2021. Professor Najjar has published numerous articles on Arab American, Middle Eastern American, and Middle Eastern theater and performance, and he is an active and innovative theater director, having directed numerous plays in New York City, Chicago, Minneapolis, Portland, and Eugene, and here at the U of O. Among his many awards and fellowships are a UO Fund for Faculty Excellence Award, a UO Faculty Research Mentor Award, an NEH Summer Institute Fellowship, a Certificate of Merit for Directing from the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival, and the Ernst G. Moll Faculty Research Fellowship in Literary Studies from the Oregon Humanities Center. Today, Professor Najjar will talk with us about his newest monograph, Middle Eastern American Theater, Communities, Cultures, and Artists, published by Bloomsbury Methuen Drama in 2021. The writing of the monograph and publication were supported by funds from the Oregon Humanities Center. Welcome, Michael. We're really looking forward to learning more about Middle Eastern American theater.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to all of you who are joining us today during your lunch break. I'm grateful that you've attended. As a theater person, we're always happy to have audiences, so thank you for that. I'm going to share my screen and actually show you the covers of the 2 publications I had the opportunity of completing while at the Oregon Humanities Center. Thank you so much to the OHC for this ability to do our work the way that we do, and these are the 2 publications that are now complete and out on bookshelves today. Thank you, Paul, Jenna, Melissa, and Peg for all you've done. It's so heartening to have the support of colleagues like yourselves who've just made it possible to do the work that we do, from the fellowship to the subvention funds. It really is, it's a blessing, to be honest. And I'm grateful for the time that you all allowed me to also complete this manuscript, which took quite a bit. And I'm happy that it's in the world now. So let's talk a little bit about Middle Eastern American as a category, as an identity. And of course, this is a contested identity, because what does it mean, really? What do we do with terms like Middle East that were created, frankly, by colonial imperial powers like Great Britain, and really situated an entire region of a world with tens of millions of people in it, according to their geographical centrality. And so we have several terms that float around that are the terms du jour, if you will, of the movement. One is Middle Eastern American. I hope you can all see the slides that I'm showing right now. Yes, great. Middle Eastern American. Middle Eastern American relies, again, on the European construct of Middle East. But also, the question is, which nations constitute this geographical designation? If you Google Middle Eastern American, or if you look it up, you sometimes find the countries that we commonly associate with the Middle East. Sometimes you find North Africa added, and sometimes you'll even find countries in South Asia. So what exactly is Middle Eastern becomes a question. Another term that's used is MENA, Middle Eastern North African, combining Middle East with the nations and cultures of North Africa. This is a more generally accepted terminology. However, it has its own difficulties because it tends to elide other distinct cultures that are found in North Africa. And as a matter of fact, I'm part of the steering committee of MENA, MENATMA, the Middle East North Africa Theater Makers Alliance. And so we decided to go with MENA instead of Middle Eastern in that particular way. But there was also a debate over that term, and some people saying, why don't we use SWANA, Southwest Asia, North Africa, as the designation. This is much more geographically correct. And so because the Middle East is technically in Southwest Asia. But of course, here is another problem. What happens when you come from this area? Are you then an Asian American if you come from Southwest Asia? And of course, as we know, that cultural designation is also something that is not that is already a contested designation by many people from South Asia, for instance, and Eastern Asia. And then, of course, North Africans would say, well, aren't we African Americans if we're, say, from Egypt? So again, a difficult negotiation as far as terminology is concerned. And then Manasa, Middle East, North Africa, South Asian. So that adds South Asia. But as we all know, South Asia has an immense population and diversity of its own. And so to add that to Middle East and North Africa becomes an even larger palette of, and another difficult negotiation. Well, let's look at the census. So let's get back to the United States. And technically, if you look here on the last census, it says, what is person one's race? White. Print, for example, German, Irish, English, Italian, Lebanese, Egyptian, etc. Well, that's interesting. Not many people who are, say, Lebanese or Egyptian consider themselves white or are viewed as quote unquote white. So what has happened is that there is no box for Middle Easterners on the census. And this leads to some very interesting problems that are larger than just nomenclature. And this article by Laura Mischer in the NBCnews.com, she writes, quote, by omitting the MENA category, the census not only deprives Middle Eastern Americans of potential funding for programs supporting our communities, but it also prevents us from understanding the strength of our numbers and others from understanding the value of our unique experiences. The 2030 census may be a decade away, but it's not too early for the community to start raising our voices to demand recognition in the country we call home. Middle Eastern Americans need and deserve a MENA category. The census may not count us, but that doesn't mean that we don't count, unquote. And this is a very real issue. I'll give you an example. My wife, Rana Halabi Najjar, who's a professor of nursing, originally wanted to do research in Arab American health disparities, but there is no data in that field because it is not considered a category outside of the white category on the census. So these lead to very real problems when we're looking at health disparities, educational disparities, social determinants of health, etc. And so the idea of having a MENA box is very important. Now, let me give you the counter argument. Many in the MENA community feel that there's enough governmental surveillance and profiling and that they do not want a box because that will only lead to further surveillance and profiling. So as you can see, not everyone in the MENA category, if we'll use that term, agrees that there should be a box because of the fear, the literal fear of governmental persecution. And so here we find that this community is not monolithic, it is not homogeneous, and therefore it will not have similar opinions on these critical issues. Of course, whiteness is another interesting conundrum. What is whiteness? But in the context of Middle Eastern Americans, a study that was done, literally published this month, that I had found says, quote, the US government's classification of Middle Eastern and North African MENA Americans as white means there is no direct way to numerically count members of this group in official statistics. Therefore, any potential disparities and inequalities faced by MENA Americans remain hidden. Nevertheless, we find that MENA Americans may not be perceived nor perceive themselves to be white. These findings underscore the minoritized status of MENA Americans and support the inclusion of a new MENA identity category in the US Census. This would allow researchers to examine the social, economic, and health status of this growing population and empower community advocates to ameliorate existing inequalities, unquote. But the question of whiteness is very interesting because now we get into questions of colorism. And as we know, Middle Easterners in general can be of many skin tones, from the lightest to the darkest. And this sense of colorism is something that is pervasive not only here, but of course in the Middle East. And there are all sorts of discriminations based on colorism in the Middle East. And so how does somebody who is very quote unquote dark skin categorized as white when in truth they're not perceived as white in the society? And so this adds another layer of complication to the notion of whiteness and being Middle Eastern or North African. And we're finding this to be another complication in our understanding of not only Middle Easterners within the US context, but also within a larger context of the world. Middle Eastern Americans themselves, if we look at the statistics here, in numbers in millions, Arab Americans are somewhere in the 2 to 3 million range. Iranian or Persian Americans, according to the last census, are around 1 million members. Jewish Americans are 7.5 million. And the question now becomes, what do we designate as Jewish Americans versus Israeli Americans? Of course, there's crossover, but not all Jewish Americans are Israeli. And maybe not all Israelis consider themselves, quote unquote, Jewish Americans in that same hierarchy. And of Turkish Americans, around 350,000. So this gives you a general idea of some of the larger groups. But of course, within the smaller minorities of those groups, we have Armenian Americans, Assyrian, Chaldean, and Syriac, Baha'i, Berber or Amazigh, Chabad Lubavitch, Hasidic Orthodox Jews, Druze, Kurdish, and Syrian Jews or Orthodox Sephardic Jews. These are even more minorities that are within the minority category. So as we can see, there are so many layers to all of this. And the notion of being able to wrap our arms around what Middle Eastern American is somewhat problematic and difficult. Two other notions I'd like to bring up are transnationalism and polyculturalism. Transnationalism is a multicultural society where immigrants are more likely to maintain contact with their culture of origin and less likely to assimilate. Loyalty to the state may compete equally with allegiance to a culture or religion. And this is something that many Middle Eastern and North African Americans contend with, a definite allegiance to the homeland versus the adopted land of the United States. And then polyculturalism, the belief that cultures are connected and mutually influencing one another, related to the greater equality, beliefs, appreciation, and comfort with diversity, a willingness for intergroup contact, and endorsement of liberal immigration and affirmative action policies. And as we see the Middle Eastern Americans go through newer and newer generations, the polycultural ethos is one that now takes hold. And we see that we really can't rely on the older notions of, say, multiculturalism, that siloed groups, when we now have people of mixed parentage, mixed ethnicities, who still identify as Middle Eastern and can retain their transnational ties to their ethnic countries of origin. Middle Eastern American theater companies are abundant in this country. We have the Darvag Theater Group, which is an Iranian American group in the Bay Area. Mosaic Theater Company, which is in Jewish theater, primarily Jewish, but they also have many polycultural performances in the Washington, D.C. area. Ajel Theatrical Group, which is an Arab American company that performs primarily in Arabic for audiences in Dearborn and travels across the US and Canada. Theater J, which is very much a Jewish theater in Washington, D.C. TART, the Turkish American Repertory Theater and Entertainment Group on the East Coast. Noor Theater, which is in New York City and has actually been awarded an Obie Award for their work. Art to Action in Florida, the Tampa Bay area. Silk Road Rising, one of the premier Middle Eastern American companies in Chicago. Golden Thread Productions, another Middle Eastern American company in San Francisco. And Pangea World Theater in Minneapolis, which is a group that does work from the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asian communities. So as you can see, there's a very rich community creating theater throughout the country from these different groups. Now, I had to ask myself when creating this book, how will I categorize these plays? And originally I thought, well, I'll try to categorize them by cultures or by national ethnicity. So I thought I'd have a chapter on, say, Iranian American or Arab American or Israeli American. Well, that actually became very problematic because of the intersectionality of all of these identities. And therefore, I found myself scrapping that whole idea and going with more of thematics. And the thematics that I came up with, based on all the plays that I had read, were these: return to the homeland plays, where characters who are immigrants to North America or the Americas return to the homeland and have to deal with being not quite American enough and definitely not quite ethnic enough in their own lands because of linguistic differences, cultural differences, societal differences. Persecution plays, societal and governmental persecution, of which there are many in this genre because it is so pervasive. And so people are writing plays that are reflecting the governmental and societal persecution they feel being othered as Middle Eastern Americans. Diaspora plays, the plays that take place by immigrants or their children in the diaspora and how they deal with being othered in the greater societies in which they live. Plays set in the homeland. So writers that are from the Americas who set their plays in the Middle East or North Africa and try to recreate the quote unquote homeland on stage through that process of translation, if you will. And conflict plays that deal with civil wars, things like the Arab Spring, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and other topics like the Armenian Genocide, which now get us into some interesting intra-conflicts, for instance, with Armenians who, of course, suffered this horrific genocide, and yet Turkish Americans that perhaps contest that the genocide even occurred. And so what do we do when we have this umbrella that is trying to bring in all of these groups and yet have contentions within them, similarly with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And how do we then represent these conflicts on stage and not either offend or cause greater rifts within these communities. And I'll take you through several of these genres that I have found that are very interesting and hopefully will be enlightening to you. These are different artists who create their works. And this is Najjar Saeed. She is the daughter of Edward Said, the scholar who, of course, wrote the seminal book Orientalism and others. She is a writer and performer, and she wrote a book called Looking for Palestine, growing up confused in an Arab American family. Several of us know exactly what that means. But also, she did a stage production called Palestine. Essentially, people like Najjar Saeed are doing theatrically what her parent was doing in a scholarly manner decades earlier. Edward Said was trying to bring greater awareness to the Orientalism that is inherent in our view of the Middle East. And people like Najjar Said and also other children of great scholars like Ismail Khalidi, who's the son of Rashid Khalidi, the Palestinian scholar who has basically taken Said's place within the pantheon of Palestinian American letters. They're trying to awaken us to what life is like in the Middle East, what these people are experiencing, and how complicated the negotiation is for those who grow up in the Americas and return to the Middle East. So Najjar Saeed talks very personally about her anorexia, her bouts with anorexia, and she ties that into her feelings of guilt about being a Palestinian American, living such a comfortable life in New York City while her relatives are suffering in the West Bank and in Gaza. So these are the kinds of things that the Return to the Homeland plays present us with. The idea that we are connected to these other places, yet we are in a privileged position when we return there, while the people who are living there are dealing with many of the unfortunate situations that sometimes are brought on by the very governments that we are supporting with our tax dollars. And this becomes one of the complicated inner conflicts that these artists are dealing with. The next play or the next genre would be societal and governmental persecution. And Yusuf El-Gundi, who's one of the most prominent Egyptian American playwrights working in the American theater, wrote a play called Back of the Throat after 9/11 about a Muslim American man living in his small apartment who gets a knock on the door and is then interrogated and brutalized by FBI agents who accuse him of being part of some terroristic plot. And El-Gundi is trying to posit that there is something inherently complicated about being Muslim American, especially after 9/11, where one is viewed with suspicion just for being Muslim. And so by dramatizing the lives of Muslim Americans, Yusuf El-Gundi is opening us up to ideas of how Muslim Americans are trying to negotiate their place in America at a time when they are being othered, viewed with suspicion, and persecuted by the government. And these are not just artistic notions. There have been many stories of the FBI and CIA infiltrating mosques, trying to set up informants, recording people without their consent. And so we're finding that the dramatists in the genre are attempting to put on stage the very fears that they're experiencing in their own lives by showing that this kind of persecution is very real, unfortunate, and very much a part of what's happening today in the United States. There are diaspora plays like Mosque Alert, where the idea of a Muslim community wanting to set up a mosque in a small town in Illinois are faced with complete and utter opposition by a business owner who has no desire to have any kind of a mosque in the town, and sets up a website called mosquealert.com and basically riles up the entire town to speak in opposition to these Muslims who are trying to set up this mosque. Interestingly enough, however, one of the characters who's gay, it tries to align with the imam of the mosque, and they have a conflict themselves when the imam cannot openly sanction the character's presence as a gay person. And so we see the intersectionality crashing within these groups that should find common cause, but cannot because of, say, traditional religious values versus the values of the people who are attempting to support them. We also see business interests that arise that say, well, having a mosque in town is bad, not just for religious reasons, but also for business reasons, that it might detract people from coming to downtown if there's this mosque there. So Jamil Khoury, who's the artistic director of Silk Road Rising in Chicago and who wrote this play, who is Christian Arab descent himself, is trying to wrestle with the complexities of what it means to have a diasporic population that is trying to achieve the quote-unquote American dream within a context where many are in opposition to their very existence within these communities, and definitely in opposition to their building of, say, religious institutions. And unfortunately, we're seeing this play out very much across the world. I mean, if we're looking at what's happening in France right now, with this desire to strip people of the right to wear religious clothing, it's not that hard to believe that this kind of dystopian view, if you will, that Jamil Khoury is positing could happen, and is already happening here in many ways. So Jamil's play is this very complex view of Middle America and how Middle America is dealing with these issues. And the Ground Zero Mosque, for instance, the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, I should say, was stopped in its tracks because of its proximity to the World Trade Center. Ironically, however, when they were excavating the wreckage of the World Trade Center, they found the cornerstone for the first Maronite Arab church that was in what was then Little Syria, almost a century before. So it's hard to believe that we have these ideas that people are somehow infiltrating these spaces, when indeed they've been there for quite a while, and we've had a kind of historical and cultural amnesia when it comes to these issues. Diaspora plays also include things like the Armenian Genocide. What happens when genocide survivors come to the United States, try to start a new life, but are beset by post-trauma and are unable to really reach their full potential because of the horrific traumas they endured in their past? And then their children are dealing with survivors' post-trauma, secondary trauma. And so this play is an Armenian American woman's desire to look back at her own parents' past and to try to understand how they both survived this horrific genocide, came to this country, and then still were unable to really find themselves, find their footing here, and how even she struggles with the past that she has inherited as an Armenian American. So this kind of work is extremely powerful and also very personal. The playwright, Adriana Savan Nichols, actually took this play to Armenia. It was translated and performed at the National Theater in Yerevan. And she said it was one of the most powerful moments of her life, being able to take a play like this back to the homeland and to perform it in the original Armenian language. So these plays transcend boundaries and cultures. Plays set in the homeland, like 9 Parts of Desire by Heather Raffo, an Iraqi American playwright and performer, where she plays 9 different Iraqi women who are dealing with the traumas of the First and Second Gulf War. And she embodies all the characters herself in this production and plays them beautifully. This was a very important post 9/11 play that dealt with not only the First Iraq War, but the Second. And since that time, Heather Raffo has written Fallujah, an opera about the Iraq War, and also a play called Noura, which is about an Iraqi American family trying to negotiate their lives in the United States in the aftermath of the US invasion and subsequent pullout of Iraq in these times. And so Heather Raffo is a very committed artist trying to ask, what does it mean to be Iraqi American in this time of these wars that are So devastating. And Rafo herself comes from an Iraqi Christian community in Mosul that has dealt with genocide of their own. So she's reflecting the traumas that people in Mosul face, not only from the US invasion, but also from ISIS and the horror that they inflicted on the populations in the Middle East in the past decade as well. Another wonderful play is Food and Fedwa, which crosses the line between plays set in the homeland and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And Food and Fedwa is a powerful play that takes place in the West Bank under curfew and deals with a Palestinian family that is trying to survive under the occupation. They're also dealing with family members that immigrated to the US and are coming back and no longer feel connected to any notions of Palestine whatsoever. And so what happens when families are broken apart because of diaspora, because of conflict, and because of war? And how can people who leave a place come back to it and still feel a connection to that place when so much has changed in their absence? And the last play I'll talk about is Wrestling Jerusalem by Aaron Davidman, a one-person show where he plays he plays both Israelis and Palestinians who are dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and he embodies all of these characters and plays them all with accent, with physicality, and it's a very powerful one-person show. One thing I do want to talk about with this particular production, which is so brilliant, is Davidman is going. He went back to Israel and he went to Palestine and he listened to the people. He embodied their stories, and he presents us with a complex dialogue between what's happening with Israelis and Palestinians. And he brings a great humanity to both sides of this conflict that is often lost when we're talking about it as this sort of abstract political war, forgetting that this is really affecting many human beings on the ground every day who are just stuck in the middle of very extreme circumstances. So the UO library has this DVD. I urge you to see it. It's also on Amazon Prime Video if you can rent it. I just highly urge you to see this if you can. It's a powerful performance. And I want to just leave with one last thing and another thank you to the Oregon Humanities Center, who provided the subvention funds for my next publication, The Vagrant Trilogy by Mona Mansour. The Oregon Humanities Center provided both subvention funds for the photograph that is on the cover that you see here, and also to pay the scholar Dia Abdo, the preeminent Palestinian scholar, to provide a critical essay. So thank you again to Oregon Humanities Center. And with that, I think I will stop and we can take some questions perhaps.
Thank you so much, Michael. Sorry for the sound complications. What I would suggest we do is after we're done, will you please send to us the links, all the YouTube links, and we will share them with everyone who has registered for the talk so they can watch them at their leisure?
Happily. Yes.
So the first question concerns something that you didn't talk about directly, but it came up indirectly, in particular, when you showed us the slide about Food and Fedwa, yes, which is a co-authored play. And I gather that it is co-authored by a Palestinian or a Palestinian American and a Jewish person as well.
Actually, no, they're both Palestinian Americans, second generation Palestinian Americans, yes.
So I wanted to ask about that question about, do any of these Arab American playwrights collaborate with non-Arab American playwrights in writing about the Arab-Israeli conflict or any other of the various topics or themes that you've mentioned?
Interestingly enough, I think the greatest example of what you're speaking of, Paul, is the band's Visit, as a matter of fact. A co-collaboration between Arab American and Jewish Israeli American composers, playwrights, and director cast. That for me is the great moment where we were able to bring together, I wasn't part of the team, but I'm saying we as a theatrical community perhaps, were able to come together and create a piece about the Middle East that had Arab actors, had Jewish actors, Israeli actors, who came together and really created this moment that showed the shared humanity of both sides. Now, to be fair, it was an Egyptian band coming to Israel, so there is the peace treaty there. They weren't Palestinian. That said, it's still such an important thing because what it does is it shows the commonality of music, culture, the fact that these people are coexisting. It's not always war. It's not always chaos and difficulty. There is coexistence happening. And I think that musical is one of the shining examples of the collaboration of which you speak.
So the next question is from Darte. And let me just give you the background here. The question, it's about Isaac Butler's new book, The Method. You may not know that book. I'm sure you know of The Method, however.
Right. Yes.
And this book addresses all the controversies around Stanislavski, as you know. And Darte is wondering if and how these debates about theatrical acting techniques inform Middle Eastern American theaters or performances.
Well, one of the difficulties that I think many quote unquote hyphenated groups face in theater is how can one retain the cultural essence while working within Western, quote unquote, Western frameworks. And I think that's something the Black arts movement, for instance, was dealing with. How do we retain an essentially Black art movement that still has to utilize proscenium arches and Western dramaturgy? And there are two thoughts on this. One is to hybridize, to say we are going to take the tools of Western theater, create a hybrid model, and create that kind of theater that looks and sounds Western, but has the themes of the Middle East. The other is to say, no, let's break away and use traditional Middle Eastern forms, like, for instance, the halakha, the circular form where people perform and people stand around them. And it's kind of a theater in the round, if you will, but it's very much based in, say, North African performance techniques. So I think that there's a debate as to how this is done. The majority of the people I've shown you work within a very Western model, however, and would utilize Stanislavskian or Strasbergian techniques, etc., because they were all trained that way. The way that we train students in the United States is very much in that method. So they were trained that way, and they're adapting their stories to that Western method. But there are others that say, no, we need to really try to capture the very traditional Middle Eastern forms and utilize those instead in order to give a greater sense of the richness of the culture by doing so.
As a related question, are there examples of Arab American plays and performances that draw on avant-garde theatrical techniques, Brechtian techniques, as a way of sort of negotiating that complexity that you just described?
Well, the one artist I'll bring up is Reza Abdo, who was one of the preeminent postmodern Iranian American artists who dealt with some of the most transgressive issues imaginable. I think Reza Abdo was the person who was able to, even though I would say the plays did not directly deal with Middle Eastern-ness, they definitely were from a Middle Eastern lens. And he and his brother, who also collaborated with him, created these productions. And they were extremely avant-garde, cutting edge, really he's considered one of the great postmodern American theater makers. And I think that would be the person I would point to as somebody who really took those avant-garde notions and took Middle Eastern American identity and melded those things together very successfully. The majority of the plays that I've written about in my book actually are not very avant-garde, if you will. They stick to traditional forms of dramaturgy, but that said, they still deal with very controversial topics because they're dealing with things like the Armenian Genocide, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Algerian civil war, etc.
It's clear that one of the aims of the book, and it's also clear that one of the aims of some of these plays, at least, is an educational aim to educate American audiences, American readers about the richness of and variety of this theatrical tradition. Can you give us a sense of the degree to which those efforts of education and spreading the word have been successful?
Well, Heather Raffo talks about the fact that when she performed her play, 9 Parts of Desire, and her opera, Fallujah, which she wrote the book for, not the music, but the book and lyrics, she said people came up to her from all walks of life wherever she traveled, whether they were in U.S. military, whether they were very right-wing, let's say politically, she said people came up to her and said, wow, I didn't really know that about those people. I mean, one of the most shocking notes I ever received after giving a lecture about Middle Eastern theater was, I had no idea that those people weren't all terrorists. And I just was, I almost fell out of my chair when I heard that. But the truth is, these artists are really performing acts of translation. And I don't mean translation linguistically, I mean translation culturally. They're taking this often maligned and stereotyped group. And if you've ever seen many films, especially American films, military films, you'll see that there's no end to the stereotyping of Middle Easterners, the anti-Semitism, the Islamophobia, it's everywhere. And Dr. Jack Shaheen, who's now passed, wrote a great book called Real Bad Arabs, R-E-E-L, Bad Arabs. And I highly recommend you reading that or see the documentary. He talks about this because ultimately the media, unfortunately, for better or worse, it tends to give us a very one or two-dimensional view of this part of the world. And these artists are saying, let's look at the three-dimensional aspect. Let's look at these people who are literally suffering under civil wars, under occupations, under tremendous economic deprivation and political deprivation if they're living under the dictators in the Middle East, who are often, unfortunately, supported by the West. So these are the kinds of things that I think these artists are trying to bring to the fore. And they also show warts and all, so to speak. They're not just giving you these pretty pictures of perfect people. As a matter of fact, they're giving very difficult portrayals sometimes that often anger the community. Some people say, we don't want to be perceived like that. Well, the truth is, we need to quote unquote air the dirty laundry and show everything if we're going to be truly honest about this portrayal.
Have there been any efforts to adapt any of these plays for the screen?
There have been, but I can tell you it's very difficult. A lot of my colleagues cannot get enough funding to put up a play, much less make a film. I know Heather Raffo is currently filming 9 Parts of Desire. It's an indie film, so it's not going to be on the big screen. But I can say that this is one of the greatest challenges we're facing in this community, which is lack of funding. I have so many colleagues with many plays on their hard drives that they can't even get enough money for readings, much less full productions. So I would just say that we need much more commitment from our own communities to get these plays produced.
Early in your talk, you spoke about colorism in the Arab American community. Have any of the plays that you've included in your study or in your anthologies dealt in particular with that topic, that complex topic?
Well, yes, there have been some. It's very interesting to me that colorism is not more directly dealt with. I think when you have a litany of troubles, it's like, which do you address? And I think that because we are so caught up in the political and social upheavals of the Middle East, oftentimes those become the primary focus or foci of the productions, as opposed to notions of colorism. But there are plays that are trying to deal with traditional notions of race, traditional notions of what does and doesn't constitute somebody's Arabness. And also, I think that over time, we're going to find many more plays that do directly deal with colorism head on, because for a very long time, it's literally been ignored or just erased. And it's I think that many of the newer theater makers are no longer willing to do that. They're willing to challenge this kind of thing head on.
The next question is about plays like the last one that you described, where you have an actor who plays multiple characters who occupy multiple subject positions among the complexities that you're describing.
Sure.
Are there a lot of performances like that? And what has been the impact of that particular approach to this problem?
I think that some of the strongest plays of the genre are solo performance, whether it's David Mann, Najjar Saeed, Layla Buck, Heather Raffo. What it does is it makes the humanity undeniable. I mean, to have somebody who, let's say, is Palestinian playing an Israeli or vice versa, to embody the very views that you may or may not agree with politically, socially, religiously, it it really is an act of transfer, and it's a very powerful act of empathy and crossing of very complicated interior borders, if you will. And by doing so, I think also it causes the audience to think and say, I can't deny this. I can no longer deny that these people have a subjectivity, they have a point of view. I think it's a very important intervention. And I think solo performance is truly one of the defining aspects of this genre, Middle Eastern American theater. There are many more, in my opinion, solo performances than there are traditional playwrights, and that I think it's bringing a great richness to the landscape, if you will, of this form.
In light of that response, are there instances where plays that do the kind of work you just described have been performed in political contexts where their humanistic emphasis could have beneficial political consequences?
Well, I think that anytime the question about theater we always ask is, are we just preaching to the converted, right? Are the people who just agree with us coming to our productions, and therefore, what are we really changing? Becomes a major question. But when a lot of these performers take these shows on the road, if you will, they do come across audiences that may or may not agree with them. And to almost to a person, when I've spoken to them, they've had positive responses. But I got to tell you, there are some that have not. There is a performer named Jennifer Najjar, who's Palestinian Christian. Her family comes from Ramallah, from as far back as you can imagine. She did a play called I Heart Hamas and Other Things I'm Afraid to Tell You. Now, she does not heart Hamas, but she does speak for the Palestinian community that's dealing with occupation. And the amount of vitriol she has faced has been tremendous. What does one do when one puts such controversial topics on the table, so to speak? And what she's trying to do is she's trying to open us up to the idea that this is a very complicated, not a quote unquote two-sided conflict. There are many shades of gray within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that she brings up. But I think that just titling her play that way automatically made people either reject her or despise her, when in truth, what she's trying to say is, I am trying to bring this, a more complicated understanding of this as a Palestinian American to this conflict, not as somebody who's looking at it as a sort of talking polemical head, if you will.
It's clear that one of your personal interests is, through the anthologies especially, but also through this book, is just to make these plays more available. Mm-hmm. The next question has to do with your efforts to get these plays published. Have publishers been completely responsive, or have you had to fight for to convince them? What's that been like?
I've been shocked and amazed that they've actually been very open, and especially the publishers I've worked with, McFarland out of North Carolina and Bloomsbury, have been very open, and I'm grateful. For a very long time, I can tell you from my own experience, I have 3 theater degrees, 3 higher education degrees, and we rarely ever came across any Middle Eastern or Arab American plays because they were not published. I mean, and to this day, there are plays that are just resting on hard drives, sitting in boxes. And so I think one of the great, the great challenges I've faced is, how do we bring the legitimacy of books? We're surrounded by books at a university. How do we bring the legitimacy to this form? Well, one way is to put it in a book, to publish it, to have it widely available, because these plays are often done once and never seen again on stage. So the only lasting impact they have is through publication. And so I feel grateful that I've been able to publish these plays, to get them out onto bookshelves at universities, theaters, etc. And also, I've had the great fortune of working with UO Special Collections to set up the Yusuf El-Gundi papers. So if you'd like to learn more about Yusuf El-Gundi, one of the premier Arab American playwrights, all you need to do is go over to our library. You can see his notes, his drafts, his original publications. I think that we in the Academy especially need to find ways to bring the plays into the Academy in a form that the Academy respects, i.e., books. And in that sense, hopefully with more and more of these publications over time, we'll get a kind of critical mass going that makes this genre undeniable. because it's been there for over 100 years, but it's just never seen. So therefore it's been denied, and we can no longer deny it any more than we can deny Asian American theater, African American theater, Native American theater, Latinx theater. It's incumbent upon us to diversify the theater. The theater has been too Euro-American centric for too long, frankly.
Do you have any evidence if these publications are getting taken up in university theater classes or theater classrooms?
I can't say I do. I can't say I am trolling theater professors to ask them what they're doing. But, I got to believe that they are. I mean, the sales have been decent according to, academic publication as far as that's concerned. The big question for me is, how many of these plays can be incorporated into classes, and then how many of them can show up on stages? Because that's the next level. It's one thing to read a play, but anybody who knows theater knows that a play is to a building what a blueprint is. It's just a blueprint. And until you embody it and create it on stage, it'll never reach its full potential and promise. So my hope is that it won't just be read, but it'll actually be taken to the next level and performed. And those plays performed, I think, will change the dynamic in performance, really.
So, Michael, we're coming to the end of our time. This next question has to do with that point that you just raised. You spoke earlier about how very few, there's so many of these plays that are not getting performed because they don't have funding to get performed. The question is about two possible solutions to that problem. One is the academy. That is, if theater professors who have the resources of universities behind them to start to publish them and produce them. The second is, and this is a COVID-related question, has the adaptation or the adoption of Zoom facilitated the spread, the ability to perform these, or at least to do readings of these plays, since there has been, a lot of such performances have been produced, performances of theater have been put on in the Zoom context?
Yeah, first let me say, for me, universities are now the regional theaters that used to exist in the 60s and 70s. Theater has become so expensive and prohibitively expensive that now major theaters are so afraid of taking the risk of producing new plays. So they just produce for lack of a better term, the same old chestnuts. However, there are theaters like ACT, who is producing Hotter Than Egypt by Yusuf El Gundi, which I just saw last weekend. So there's still theaters out there that are willing to take the risks, professional theaters. That's great. But universities need to step up. I hate to say it, but university productions often reflect the larger mainstream, which is they produce the same Shakespeare, bless Shakespeare. We love Shakespeare, but I don't know how Shakespeare became an American playwright. We put in tens of millions of dollars a year in the American theater into Shakespeare when we have starving American playwrights in their garrets writing these plays. So I'm going to ask everybody who is theatrically related, please maybe consider a living playwright, because they need to get paid. Every time we do their plays, they get paid a little bit. It's not much, but at least it's something. And maybe it'll keep them going long enough until they have their breakout success. That said, the Zoom situation has made mediatized productions possible. So my colleague, Andrea Assef from Art to Action in Florida, filmed her 11 Reflections on September, the play about 9/11, and it is now being shown on Zoom. My colleague Denmo Ibrahim shot her play Brilliant Mind as a mediatized play, and it's being now presented in different contexts on Zoom and other places. So I think that the Zoom factor is helpful, but as you know, Paul, theater is live, and no matter how well a play is produced on screen, it's never going to capture the experience. Watching Hamilton on Disney Plus is not like sitting in a theater watching Hamilton. It just isn't, but it's the next best thing. So I think that hopefully the Zoom intervention will be just something that helps move the genre along, but I don't see it as a panacea.
Well, thank you, Michael, for sharing your book in print talk with us today. It's been a real pleasure. Keep up the great, important work. We so appreciate what you're trying to do and what you're accomplishing. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks to everyone at the Oregon Humanities Center, and thanks to all of you who've attended today. I'm grateful.
Thanks again for joining us for Michael Malik Najjar's book in print talk on Middle Eastern American theater, communities, cultures, and artists. For more information about the Oregon Humanities Center, or if you'd like to contribute to supporting our research and public programs, go to ohc.uoregon.edu. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.